Imagine waking up one day and realizing your entire life is a lie. A name that isn't yours. A past that's been erased. A ring on your finger that belonged to a woman who disappeared a decade ago. That's exactly what happens when Julia Monroe steps into billionaire Damien Vance's office, wearing the engagement ring of his ex-fiancée, Eleanor St. James, who vanished without a trace. Coincidence? Impossible. As Damien digs deeper, secrets unravel. A forgotten past, a sinister experiment, a powerful enemy who will stop at nothing to keep the truth buried. But the real question is, who is Julia Monroe? And if she isn't Eleanor, then why does her soul remember him? A story of love, betrayal, and the fight to reclaim identity begins now. Stay until the end, because the biggest twist is yet to come. Subscribe, hit the like button, and get ready for a journey where nothing is as it seems. The towering skyline of New York City sprawled beyond the glass walls of Vance Industries, reflecting a world built on wealth, power, and absolute control. Inside the executive office on the 50th floor, Damien Vance sat behind his mahogany desk, focused, meticulous, and calculating, just as he always was. The polished black surface of his state-of-the-art computer glowed with the latest financial reports, figures flashing across the screen in neat columns. Numbers had always made sense to him. People, not as much. Everything in Damien's world operated with precise order. His schedule, his investments, his business empire. There were no mistakes, no chaos, and that was exactly how he liked it. Today, however, something was off. A nagging feeling had gnawed at the edges of his mind since the morning, something he couldn't name, but refused to ignore. His intercom buzzed, breaking the silence. "Mr. Vance, your new executive assistant is here." Damien exhaled through his nose, already irritated. His previous assistant had lasted only 3 months before proving herself inadequate. He had little patience for incompetence. "Send her in," he said curtly. The heavy oak door swung open, and Julia Monroe walked in with quiet confidence. Damien barely looked at her at first. He flicked his gaze over her sharp black dress, her neatly styled hair, and the polished demeanor that suggested she knew how to handle herself in high-pressure environments. That was good. He had no interest in dealing with anyone who couldn't keep up. But then, his eyes caught something small, something insignificant to anyone else, something that stopped his breath in his throat. A solitaire diamond ring glinted on her slender left hand. Not just any ring, his ring. The very ring he had slid onto Eleanor St. James's finger the night before their wedding. The one that had vanished with her when she had disappeared, without a word, without a trace, 10 years ago. The room tilted for a fraction of a second. Damien forced his expression to remain neutral, but his pulse slammed inside his chest. This is impossible. His eyes narrowed slightly. The cut, the clarity. It was identical. No, not identical. It was the same ring. It had to be. "Miss Monroe," he said smoothly, masking every emotion boiling beneath his skin. "Take a seat." She did, crossing her legs elegantly, completely unaware of the storm she had just unleashed within him. "Your resume is impressive," he said, keeping his voice casual. "I assume you're aware of the standards I expect." "Yes, Mr. Vance," she replied with a quiet confidence. "Excellence. No mistakes. No wasted time." She was sharp. Too sharp. But that didn't explain the damn ring. "That ring," he said suddenly. Not a question, a statement. Julia blinked, glancing down at her hand as if she had never given it much thought before. "Oh, this," she said lightly, holding up her left hand. "It belonged to my family. A gift from my adoptive mother when I turned 18. His breath turned cold. "Adoptive mother," he repeated, voice dangerously calm. "Yes," she smiled. "She always said it was a part of my past." Damien's grip on his pen tightened, so hard his knuckles turned white. The world around him blurred for a moment. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. His mind whispered the unthinkable. What if Eleanor never truly left? What if the truth had been buried instead? Damien barely processed the rest of Julia's words. The moment she left his office, he sat completely still. The ring burned into his memory like a scar. It's the same ring. I know it is. The possibility gnawed at him like a blade twisting inside his ribs. The past had clawed its way into his present, and he wasn't about to ignore it. He picked up his phone. "Silas," he said, voice tight with barely concealed urgency. "I need you to look into someone for me. Now." 2 hours later, a private investigator's office. Silas Ward was a man who thrived on secrets. A former intelligence operative turned private investigator, he had been Damien's go-to-fixer for years. He sat across from Damien in his dark, leather-lined office, flipping through a thick file on Julia Monroe. "Nothing alarming at first glance," Silas said, rubbing his jaw. "She grew up in upstate New York in a modest home. Adopted at birth. No known relatives. Clean background." Damien didn't blink. "The rings." Silas exhaled sharply. "That's where it gets weird." Damien leaned forward. "There's no record of that ring ever being sold, pawned, or transferred," Silas said. "No insurance claims. No paper trail. If it's the same one." He paused, then gave Damien a look. "Someone went to great lengths to erase its existence." Damien's jaw clenched. Someone had taken Eleanor's ring and placed it on the hand of a woman with no memory of what it meant. Or worse, what if she did know? "Dig deeper," Damien ordered. "I want everything. No detail is too small." Silas hesitated. "You sure you want to go down this road, Damien?" Damien's voice dropped. "This ghost just walked into my office wearing my ex-fiancée's ring. You tell me. How the hell do I ignore that?" Silas sighed, already sensing the obsession creeping into Damien's voice. But he nodded. "I'll find out what I can." That evening, Damien's penthouse. The skyline stretched before him, but Damien saw nothing but the past. A wedding, a missing bride, a love that turned to dust, and now, a woman who wore Eleanor's ring like it meant nothing. He poured himself a drink, fingers gripping the glass too tightly. Tomorrow, he'd confront Julia again. And this time, he wouldn't walk away without answers. The storm outside was relentless. Thunder rolled across the city, and rain drummed against the glass walls of Damien's penthouse, as if mirroring the turmoil within him. He hadn't slept a minute since the meeting with Julia Monroe. How could he? The ring. It was like staring into a wound that had never fully healed, a fragment of a love story that had been ripped away from him a decade ago. Damien poured himself another drink, the ice clinking against the glass. Bourbon, his only comfort when the ghosts of the past came crawling back. Eleanor. Her name was a whisper in his mind, as familiar as his own heartbeat. Her laughter, her scent, the way she used to trace circles on his wrist when she thought he wasn't paying attention. He could recall every detail of her, even after all these years. And now, her ring had resurfaced, on another woman's hand. Damien's fingers tightened around the glass. "Mr. Vance." The voice pulled him back into the present. He turned to see Harris, his butler, standing in the doorway. "There's a call for you, sir. Mr. Ward says it's urgent." Damien set down his drink and took the phone. "Tell me you have something." Silas exhaled on the other end. "You're not going to like it." 1 hour later, Silas Ward's office. Silas had always been a man who thrived in the shadows. His office was a reflection of that. Dark wood, low lighting, and the faint scent of old paper and whiskey. He handed Damien a folder thick with documents. "You asked me to dig. I dug." Damien flipped it open and scanned the pages. Julia Monroe, adopted at birth. No known biological relatives. Clean record. But something stood out, a missing 2-year gap in her childhood records. Damien's eyes narrowed. 2 years unaccounted for. What the hell happened to her between the ages of 4 and 6? Silas hesitated. No records exist. It's like she just vanished during those years and reappeared later with a different foster family. "That doesn't happen by accident," Damien murmured. "No, it doesn't." Silas leaned forward. Damien, I don't think Julia Monroe is who she thinks she is. A slow, chilling realization settled in Damien's chest. You think she's Eleanor? Silas didn't blink. I think it's a possibility. The words sent a shock through him. It was impossible. And yet, how would that even be possible? If she were Eleanor, she would remember. Silas's face darkened. Not if someone didn't want her to. Damien felt his stomach turn. If Julia Monroe was Eleanor, someone had erased her past. And that meant Victor St. James had something to do with it. Damien's grip tightened on the folder. I need to confront her now. The next morning, Damien didn't wait. Julia barely had time to settle into her desk before she heard his voice. In my office. Now. She blinked, startled by the cold authority in his tone. Sir. Now, Miss Monroe. She obeyed without hesitation, following him into the large office as he shut the door behind her. For a long moment, he just stared at her. She shifted under his gaze. Did I do something wrong, Mr. Vance? His voice was low and deliberate. Tell me, Miss Monroe, have you ever heard the name Eleanor St. James? The color drained from her face. She froze, a flicker of something in her expression, too quick to catch. But Damien saw it. She didn't recognize the name, or she was trying to hide that she did. Julia swallowed. No, I don't think so. Should I? Damien's jaw clenched. She was my fiancée. She disappeared 10 years ago. Julia shifted uneasily. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Vance. Damien leaned in, studying every inch of her reaction. You're wearing her ring, Miss Monroe. She stared at him, her lips parting slightly, confused, shaken. What? That's not possible. And yet here we are. Her fingers trembled slightly as she looked down at the ring. Damien didn't stop. I had it made for her. It was unique, custom designed. There is no other ring like it in the world. Julia's breathing quickened. Mr. Vance, I don't know what you're trying to imply, but where did you get it, Julia? Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. It was a gift from my adoptive mother. Who was she? She passed away years ago. Damien's stare hardened. And before that, before you were adopted, her lips parted, but no sound came out, because she didn't know. And Damien felt it in his bones. You don't remember, do you? Tension thickened between them. Julia's voice wavered. I've always had gaps in my memory, from when I was little. But that doesn't mean. What if it does? Damien cut in. Silence. She didn't answer, because deep down, she felt it too. Something was missing. Something was wrong. Damien exhaled sharply and stood up. I'm going to find out the truth, Julia, whether you're ready or not. Her voice was barely a whisper. Why do I feel like I already know the answers? Damien's heart pounded. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't chance. The woman standing in front of him was connected to Eleanor St. James. The only question was how, and more importantly, who had hidden her past from her. The moment Julia left his office, Damien was already making calls. He didn't trust coincidences. He never had. And Julia Monroe was no coincidence. She was a link, whether she realized it or not, to Eleanor St. James. The question was why? Why had she been given that ring? Why were 2 years missing from her childhood records? And more importantly, did Victor St. James have something to do with it? Damien's jaw clenched as he picked up his phone and dialed. I need a meeting. Tonight. Later that night, a private club in Manhattan. The St. James family was old money, generations of wealth built on power and secrets. And Victor St. James was their gatekeeper. Damien waited in the dimly lit lounge, sipping bourbon, his mind calculating every possible move. Then the devil himself walked in. Victor St. James. He was older now, but still sharp, still calculating. A man who could ruin lives with a whisper. To what do I owe this unpleasant surprise, Damien? Victor said, sitting across from him. Damien cut straight to the point. Where is Eleanor? Victor's expression didn't even flicker. Still chasing ghosts. I see. Damien leaned forward, voice low and dangerous. She's not a ghost, and neither is her ring. For the first time, Victor's expression shifted. A flicker of something. Unease. Annoyance. I don't know what you think you've discovered, but Eleanor is gone. Dead. You need to let this go. Damien's stomach twisted. Then, why is an assistant at my company wearing her engagement ring? Victor's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Damien smirked. He had him. I suggest you walk away from this, Damien, Victor said after a long silence. Some doors should stay closed. Damien's blood turned to ice. Victor knew something, and that meant he was hiding something. That sounds like a threat, Damien said coldly. Victor's smile was chilling. Only if you don't listen. Damien stood, placing his glass down with deliberate force. I never listen, Victor. As he walked away, he could feel Victor's eyes on him. This wasn't over. Not even close. The annual Vance Industries Charity Gala was always a spectacle, an extravagant display of wealth, power, and influence. Tonight, it was something else entirely. Tonight, it was a battlefield. Damien stood near the ballroom entrance, scanning the crowd, his mind a storm of calculations. Victor was here, and Julia was here. He needed to see them together. He needed to know if she reacted to him, because if she did, that meant everything. Julia's perspective. Julia had been to gala events before, but none quite like this. This was elegance on another level. Chandeliers dripping in crystals, music drifting through the air like a spell, men in perfectly tailored suits and women in exquisite gowns. And then there was Damien. He was power in human form, dark suit, piercing gaze, an aura of complete control. And for some reason, he had been watching her all night. Julia felt the weight of his stare as she sipped champagne, a slow unease curling in her stomach. Something was wrong, and then she saw him, a man she didn't recognize. But for some reason, her heart started pounding. She had no idea why. Are you all right, Miss Monroe? Julia jumped at the sound of Damien's voice. He had appeared beside her, silent as a shadow. Who is that? She asked, unable to tear her eyes away from the older man across the room. That, Damien said smoothly, is Victor St. James. Julia's breath caught. Her hands trembled. And then, flashes, images, voices. A child crying, a dark room, a hand gripping hers, pulling her away. You have to forget, sweetheart. You have to forget. The room tilted. Julia stumbled slightly, but Damien's hand caught her waist. Easy, he murmured, watching her like a hawk. Julia's breathing was ragged. She didn't know why. All she knew was something inside her had just cracked open. Victor's perspective. Victor St. James saw it happen, saw the exact moment Julia's mind betrayed her. And for the first time in years, a ripple of fear ran down his spine. Damien Vance had just changed the game. And if he didn't stop this now, the truth would come out. Victor clenched his jaw and walked toward them. The confrontation. Miss Monroe, isn't it? Julia turned, her head still swimming. Victor St. James was in front of her, smiling. A cold, knowing smile. Have we met? She asked, her voice slightly unsteady. Victor chuckled. Not exactly. Damien stepped closer. She knows you, Victor, even if she doesn't remember. Victor's smile never wavered. You should be careful, Damien. Some things should stay buried. Julia felt like she was drowning. The images, the flashes. Miss Monroe, are you feeling well? Victor asked. And then, he touched her arm. A shockwave went through her. And suddenly, she knew. She didn't know how, but she knew. She had met him before, somewhere, somewhen. Her vision blurred. Her heart slammed against her ribs, and everything inside her screamed to run. Damien noticed, and for the first time that night, his expression turned deadly. Stay away from her, Victor, he said coldly. Victor smiled. Or what? Damien's gaze was like a blade against the throat. Or I'll make sure the world knows what you did to Eleanor St. James. Victor's smile vanished, and in that moment, Damien knew he had won this round. But the war was just beginning. Damien couldn't sleep. Even hours after the gala ended, His mind was still trapped in that moment. The instant Julia's entire body tensed when Victor St. James touched her arm. It wasn't just discomfort, it was recognition. Damien had seen that look before, in people who had forgotten something vital and suddenly remembered a piece of it. Julia Monroe had felt something, and if she had felt something, it meant she wasn't just some stranger. She was connected to Eleanor. Damien stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. New York City sprawled before him like a sea of flickering stars. His fingers tightened around a glass of bourbon as he made his decision. There was one place where he might find answers: the St. James estate. The mansion had been abandoned after Eleanor's disappearance. Victor had shut it down, claiming it held too many memories. Damien had never believed him. Tonight, he was going to find out what Victor really buried there. An hour later, the St. James estate. The St. James mansion loomed in the darkness, its stone walls covered in ivy, its grand windows darkened like empty eyes. Damien ignored the no trespassing signs and stepped onto the grounds. The gates weren't even locked. Either Victor believed no one would be foolish enough to break in, or he wanted someone to come looking. Damien didn't hesitate as he pushed open the heavy front doors. The inside smelled like dust and forgotten time, everything preserved as if waiting for Eleanor to return. He moved through the hallways, his fingers brushing against familiar places. The banister Eleanor once leaned on while laughing, the piano she used to play. And then he found her room. It was exactly as she had left it. A canopy bed, pale blue walls, a vanity covered in a thin layer of dust. But was what lay on the dresser that made his heart stop. A journal. Damien picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped it open. And there, in Eleanor's elegant handwriting, were the words that changed everything. If something happens to me, know this. I didn't leave. I didn't run away. I was taken. Damien exhaled sharply. She knew. She knew she was in danger. And yet, no one had believed him when he said her disappearance wasn't voluntary. Now, finally, he had proof. But before he could read further, he heard a noise behind him. A breath. A presence. Someone was here. Damien turned, ready to fight. Julia's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Ever since the gala, she had felt wrong, as if something inside her was shifting, breaking open, trying to tell her something. And that man, Victor St. James. Why had she felt like she knew him? Why had his voice made her stomach twist in fear? She had spent all night trying to push it away, but the feeling only grew stronger. By morning, she couldn't ignore it anymore. So she made a decision. She was going to find answers. And the only place to start was the St. James mansion. An hour later, the St. James estate. Julia didn't remember driving there. All she knew was that one moment she was in her apartment, and the next she was standing at the gates of the abandoned estate. She had never been here before, and yet it felt familiar. She stepped inside cautiously, her heart pounding against her ribs. The house was too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Julia moved through the corridors, her fingers tracing the old wallpaper, her chest tightening with a feeling she couldn't name. And then she heard movement, footsteps, in Eleanor's old bedroom. Slowly, she pushed the door open and came face to face with Damien Vance. He was standing there, holding a journal, his expression unreadable. They stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken words. "What are you doing here?" Damien asked, his voice low. Julia swallowed hard. "I don't know." Damien's eyes scanned her carefully, as if trying to read her soul. "You knew this place before, didn't you?" Julia's head throbbed. Did she? She shouldn't. And yet, the moment she had walked in, memories had begun stirring. Laughter echoing down the halls. A girl's voice. The scent of roses. Julia stepped back. "I don't remember." "Liar," Damien murmured, stepping closer. "You feel it, don't you? This house. This room." Her stomach twisted. "I don't know what's happening to me." Damien watched her carefully, then held up the journal. Eleanor wrote this. Julia's heart stopped. "My fiancée, the woman who disappeared." The woman who wore the same ring you're wearing now. Julia's breath hitched. Damien, She didn't leave me, Julia. She was taken. The words sent a shock through her body. Taken. The word felt right, as if it had been waiting in the back of her mind for years. Julia suddenly couldn't breathe. The walls felt too tight. Damien stepped closer. His voice was softer now, but no less intense. What if you're Eleanor? Julia shook her head. That's impossible. Then prove it. Her entire world tilted. She needed to leave. Now. But when she turned toward the door, Victor St. James was standing there. Julia froze in place. Victor St. James stood in the doorway of the dimly lit bedroom, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark omen. His expression was unreadable, calm, but with something sharp lurking beneath. Well, he murmured, stepping into the room, his polished shoes barely making a sound on the wooden floor. I wasn't expecting visitors tonight. Damien immediately positioned himself in front of Julia, his body tense, radiating pure menace. Stay the hell away from her, he growled. Victor chuckled, a slow, deliberate sound. Her. His sharp gaze flicked to Julia, assessing her with an interest that made her skin crawl. It's funny, Victor mused. You remind me of someone. Someone who caused quite a bit of trouble for me. Julia shuddered. A whisper of something familiar brushed against the edges of her mind. Not a memory, but a feeling. Fear. Why did this man terrify her? Why did her entire body scream to run? You're lying. Damien snapped. You know exactly who she is. Victor smiled, slow and cold. Do I? His eyes locked onto Julia's, watching her closely, as if waiting for her to react. Tell me, my dear, he murmured, voice deceptively soft. What do you remember? Julia's throat went dry. I don't know. Victor tilted his head, mock sympathy in his expression. That's a shame. Memory is such a fragile thing, don't you think? A sharp chill ran down Julia's spine. He knew. She didn't know how, but she knew. Victor knew everything. The escape. Damien had heard enough. We're leaving, he said, grabbing Julia's wrist and pulling her toward the door. Victor didn't stop them. He just watched. Be careful, Damien, he called out. Some truths are better left buried. Julia felt sick. They barely made it out of the mansion before her legs gave out. Julia. Damien caught her before she collapsed onto the stone steps. She was shaking violently. He knows, she whispered. Damien, he knows who I am. Damien's jaw clenched. Then it's time we find out too. Later that night, Silas's office. Damien slammed a file onto Silas's desk. Tell me the truth, he demanded. What do you know about Julia Monroe? Silas didn't look surprised. That was the first red flag. I told you what I found, Silas said calmly. You told me what you wanted me to know, Damien snapped. Not the whole truth. Silas sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Damien, don't lie. Silence. Then, finally, Silas spoke the words Damien never expected. She's Eleanor, Damien. Damien's blood turned to ice. What? Silas exhaled sharply. I suspected it. I couldn't be sure. Damien felt like the world had just tilted. Why didn't you tell me? Silas's expression darkened. Because if I told you, you wouldn't have let it go. And now, you're too deep. Damien's hands curled into fists. You betrayed me. Silas didn't deny it. I was trying to protect you. Damien wanted to punch something. You don't get to decide that. Silas's face was grim. I think Victor St. James did something to her, Damien. Something to erase her past. Damien's entire body went still. Then we need to undo it. Silas looked genuinely afraid. If you do that, there might be no going back. Damien's voice was cold. There's no going back anyway. Julia couldn't stop shaking. She sat in Damien's office, staring at her own reflection in the window. Who was she? Eleanor St. James. The name felt foreign and familiar all at once. Her head ached, a dull, persistent pounding that had started the moment she'd seen Victor St. James. The man who, according to Damien, might have erased her past. Julia pressed a hand to her forehead, frustration boiling inside her. Why we do that? Because he had something to lose, Damien said from behind her. Julia turned, watching him carefully. What do you mean? Damien's eyes were dark with certainty. I think Victor needed you to forget something. And whatever it is, it's dangerous. Julia's stomach twisted. She felt it, a truth lurking just beneath the surface. Something she wasn't supposed to remember. Then let's find out what it is. The secret files. Silas, despite everything, still had resources. And tonight, he came through. I found something, he said, handing Damien a flash drive. Damien plugged it into his laptop. Julia held her breath as dozens of medical records appeared on the screen. Her name was listed. Eleanor St. James. Multiple sessions. Experimental memory therapy. A doctor's note. The patient shows significant signs of dissociation. Attempts to fully erase traumatic memories were only partially successful. Further sessions needed. Julia's heart slammed against her ribs. He did this to me. Damien's expression was pure fury. He erased your life. Julia's breathing grew unsteady. The memories were there, buried, waiting. Then let's bring them back. Julia's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the desk, staring at the screen. Multiple sessions. Memory therapy. Dissociation. The words blurred together as her breathing turned shallow. This is me, she whispered. Damien stood beside her, his body tense with barely contained rage. They wiped your memory, he said. Victor St. James erased who you were. Julia squeezed her eyes shut, a sharp pain shooting through her skull. But why? Silas, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. I think the answer lies at her grave. Julia snapped her head up. My grave? Silas nodded grimly. Eleanor St. James was declared dead, but I have reason to believe there was never a body. Silence. Then Damien spoke, his voice deadly calm. Then we dig. The cemetery, midnight. The cemetery was eerily silent, the wind rustling through the trees as Damien, Julia, and Silas approached Eleanor's grave. The headstone was polished, untouched by time. Eleanor St. James. Forever loved, never forgotten. Julia's stomach churned. I don't remember this place. That's because you were never buried here, Damien said. Then he pulled out a shovel. Julia's breath hitched. You're serious? Damien didn't answer. He just started digging. Every shovel full of dirt sent a pulse of dread through Julia's body. And then, a dull thud. Silas wiped the sweat from his forehead. That's the casket. Damien's jaw tightened. Open it. Julia's heart pounded painfully as Silas cracked the lid open. She braced herself for a corpse, for proof that she wasn't Eleanor. But when the casket finally opened, it was empty. Cold shock washed over Julia. Damien exhaled sharply. I knew it. Julia took a staggered step back. What the hell is happening? Silas's voice was grim. Eleanor St. James never died. Julia's entire world spun. Damien turned to her. His gaze was intense, unwavering. This is the proof we needed. You're not Julia Monroe. His voice lowered to a whisper. You are Eleanor St. James. And for the first time, Julia felt it. A name she had run from. A life she had forgotten. And now it was coming back. Julia sat in silence as they drove back from the cemetery. She stared at her hands, her mind spinning. She had spent her life believing she was Julia Monroe, a woman with no past, no history before age 6. But now, everything was falling apart. Say something, Damien said from the driver's seat. Julia's fingers curled into fists. What do you want me to say? Damien's grip tightened on the steering wheel. I want to know what you're thinking. Julia let out a harsh breath. I'm thinking I don't know who the hell I am anymore. Damien's jaw ticked. You're Eleanor. Julia laughed bitterly. You say that like it should mean something to me. It should. Julia turned to face him. But it doesn't. Damien pulled the car over, parking on the side of the road. He turned toward her, his expression taut with frustration. "You have no idea how long I've searched for you." Julia swallowed hard. "I didn't ask to be found." Silence. For the first time, Damien looked lost. "You were my fiancé," he murmured, voice softer now. "We were supposed to get married." Julia's breath hitched. She wanted to remember. She just couldn't. "Damien, I don't know how to be her." His gaze was intense, unwavering. "Then let me help you remember." Later that night, Damien's penthouse. Julia stood in front of fireplace. Damien's penthouse, feeling strangely familiar in a way she couldn't explain. Damien approached her carefully. "I need to show you something." He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it. Inside was her engagement ring, the one she had been wearing all along. Julia felt dizzy. "It's always been yours," Damien said. Julia reached for it without thinking, but the moment her fingers touched the ring, a memory slammed into her. A memory resurfaces. "Eleanor, run." A voice, urgent, desperate. She was running down a dark hallway, a hand grabbing her wrist. "You can't escape, Eleanor." Her body froze. Victor's voice, his face looming in the shadows. Pain. A sharp prick in her neck. And then, darkness. Julia gasped, staggering backward. Damien caught her just before she collapsed. "What happened?" he demanded. Julia shook violently. "Victor, he did something to me." Her breath hitched. "He took me." Damien's face darkened. "Then it's time we take you back." Julia lifted her gaze to him, and for the first time, she believed it. She was Eleanor St. James, and Victor St. James was going to pay. The memories wouldn't stop. Julia, no Eleanor, sat on the edge of the couch in Damien's penthouse, gripping her temples as fragments of the past slammed into her like tidal waves. The smell of antiseptic, the cold, sterile walls of a medical facility, a needle piercing her skin. "You have to forget, Eleanor. You'll be safer this way." She jerked forward with a gasp, her breathing shallow, her heart racing like it was trying to pound out of her chest. Damien was instantly beside her, his hands gripping her arms. "What did you see?" His voice was calm, but the intensity in his gaze betrayed his desperation. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him. He was the only person she had left to trust. "They wiped my memory," she whispered. Damien's expression darkened. "Who?" Eleanor's hands trembled. "Victor and a doctor. I don't remember his face, but I know it happened in a hospital or a lab." Damien cursed under his breath and stood, pacing the length of the room. "That bastard. He didn't just make you disappear. He rewrote you." Eleanor felt sick. "I need to know everything," she whispered. Damien's gaze snapped to hers. "Then we go to the source." Eleanor blinked. "What?" Damien's jaw tightened. "Victor isn't the only one involved. If this was a medical experiment, then someone recorded it. And I know exactly where we're going to find those records." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "Where?" Damien exhaled slowly, his expression deadly. "St. James Pharmaceuticals. Breaking in St. James Pharmaceuticals." Damien had connections everywhere. That was how they found themselves outside the corporate headquarters of St. James Pharmaceuticals at midnight, dressed in dark clothing, waiting for their moment. The building was a fortress, high-tech security, guards patrolling the lobby. Eleanor's pulse pounded. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. Damien's smirk was pure confidence. "I own half the security companies that built this place. Trust me, I know how to break into it." Silas had secured them employee access cards, but there was no room for error. Once inside, they moved swiftly through the hallways, avoiding security cameras. Finally, they reached the medical archives. Damien swiped his card, and the door clicked open. Inside, rows upon rows of medical files and digital servers glowed under the dim light. Eleanor shuddered. She had been here before. She just didn't remember it. "Look for anything under Eleanor St. James or any mention of erased memories," Damien said. Eleanor started searching through the files, her hands shaking. And then, she found it. A thin, manila folder labeled, "Patient ESJ, Cognitive Reconstruction Trials. Her breath caught. She opened it, her stomach twisting with nausea. There were detailed reports, her medical history, brain scans, notes on memory suppression. And at the bottom, a signature. Dr. Harlan Reed, she whispered. Damien leaned over her shoulder, reading the name. Who the hell is that? Eleanor's head throbbed. The doctor who erased me. Eleanor and Damien drove in silence, the folder resting between them like a ticking bomb. Dr. Harlan Reed. The name sent chills down Eleanor's spine. We need to find him, Damien said, his grip on the wheel tight. Eleanor swallowed. What if he doesn't want to be found? Damien's smirk was dangerous. Then we make him talk. The doctor's house. Confrontation. Dr. Harlan Reed lived in a secluded estate, far away from the city. A man like him didn't want to be found, which was exactly why Damien knocked on his door at 2 a.m. The doctor opened the door and immediately tried to slam it shut. Damien's foot stopped it. We need to talk, he said. Dr. Reed's face went pale when he saw Eleanor standing behind Damien. No, he whispered. You're supposed to be. His eyes widened. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Dead, she finished for him. The doctor stumbled back. What do you want? Damien stepped inside. Answers. The horrifying truth. Dr. Reed sat across from them, his hands shaking. I was forced into this, he said. Victor St. James gave me no choice. Eleanor's fists clenched. What did you do to me? Dr. Reed hesitated. Then he spoke the words that changed everything. Victor didn't just erase your memories. He experimented on you. Silence. Eleanor's stomach twisted. What? Dr. Reed swallowed. He wanted to see if a person's entire identity could be rewritten. You weren't the only one, Eleanor. There were others. Damien's eyes darkened. Where are they? Dr. Reed shook his head. I don't know. The experiment was shut down years ago. But Victor made sure you were the only one who survived. Eleanor's breath hitched. Why? Dr. Reed hesitated. Because you were special. Eleanor felt sick. Damien's hand tightened into a fist. We're done here, he growled. He grabbed Eleanor's wrist, leading her toward the door. Dr. Reed called out after them. If you try to undo what was done to you, there's no telling what will happen. Eleanor stopped. Her fingers trembled. Then she turned and met the doctor's gaze. I don't care. She walked out without looking back. The night air was thick with the scent of rain, a heavy storm rolling in over the city, mirroring the turmoil inside Eleanor's mind. She sat in the passenger seat of Damien's car, gripping the folder of medical documents tighter than necessary, her knuckles turning white. What if this is bigger than just me? She whispered. Damien's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Then we burn it all down. She turned to him, searching his face. You would do that? His jaw clenched. For you. I'd do worse. Eleanor's heart pounded. She wasn't sure if that should terrify her, or if it was the only thing keeping her sane. Finding the lab. Silas had found something, an old blueprint hidden in the St. James Pharmaceutical Archives. A lab that no longer existed, or so the records claimed. It was shut down years ago. Silas had said over the phone. But places like that don't just disappear. Victor wouldn't leave something this important unprotected. Eleanor exhaled shakily. So we find it. Breaking in. The lab was hidden beneath an abandoned building, just outside the city limits. Damien and Eleanor moved quickly, dressed in dark clothing, avoiding security cameras. When they reached the metal doors leading underground, Damien tried the security panel. Locked. Stand back, he said. Eleanor barely had time to move before he slammed his fist into the keypad. Sparks flew, and the lock clicked open. Impressive, she muttered. Damien smirked. I have my moments. They stepped inside, and immediately Eleanor's stomach turned. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the cold metal walls. And then the memories hit her. She gasped, stumbling back against Damien. Eleanor. Flashes. A hospital bed. Restraints digging into her wrists. Victor's voice. A needle. Her body convulsed with panic. Damien grabbed her shoulders, grounding her. Stay with me. She forced herself to breathe. I was here. I remember. Damien nodded grimly. Then let's finish this. They moved deeper inside. And then, they found the files. A row of cabinets, filled with years of classified experiments. Eleanor's hands shook as she pulled open a drawer. She skimmed through pages of reports, her name, her scans, her erased memories. And then she found something worse. Other names, other victims, dozens of them, and most of them marked deceased. Her breath hitched. They didn't just erase me, she whispered. They killed the others. Damien's expression turned murderous. Victor is going to pay for this. Eleanor felt sick. No, she said, her voice shaking. We make sure he never does this again. Damien met her gaze. Then we burn it down. Eleanor nodded. Burn it all. And together, they set the past on fire. The flames devoured everything. Eleanor stood beside Damien, watching the fire consume the hidden lab, the experiments, the evidence of Victor's crimes. The past was burning to ash. But the war was far from over. Back at Damien's penthouse, Eleanor sat on the edge of his bed, exhausted, drained. Damien sat beside her, silent. After a long pause, she whispered, "Do you think I can ever be her again?" Damien's gaze softened. "You're already her." Eleanor exhaled shakily. "Then why does it feel like I'm still lost?" Damien reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Because you're still healing." She looked up at him, searching his face. "And what if I don't remember everything?" Damien's lips twisted into something sad. "Then I'll love the woman you are now." Eleanor's breath hitched. "You still love me?" "I never stopped." The words broke something inside her. And before she could think, before she could stop herself, she kissed him. Damien froze for a split second. Then he pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, as if he would never let her go again. The kiss was desperate, deep, filled with everything they had lost and everything they had found again. When they finally broke apart, Damien rested his forehead against hers. "I won't lose you again." Eleanor's heart ached. "Then don't let go." And for the first time in years, she felt like she was home. The scent of smoke still clung to Eleanor's hair. She sat on the edge of Damien's bed, staring at her hands, hands that had just set Victor St. James's secret laboratory on fire. Her heart should have felt lighter, but instead, a storm churned inside her. "He's going to come for me," she whispered. Damien sat beside her, his jaw tight. "Let him try." Eleanor exhaled shakily. "Damien, you don't understand. Victor isn't just a man. He's a force. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." Damien's hand tightened into a fist. "And what does he want?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "Control. Over me. Over everything." Damien's gaze darkened. "Then we end this before he gets the chance." Victor's warning. The next morning, Damien's security breached the penthouse. "Sir," one of them said, breathless. "There was a package delivered this morning. No return address." Damien's gut twisted. He and Eleanor exchanged a glance before he grabbed the package. Inside was a single envelope, a letter, handwritten. Damien unfolded it, his blood turning to ice as he read, "You took something from me. Now I'm taking something from you. V." Eleanor's breath hitched. "No." Her hands trembled as she snatched the letter from Damien. "He's not bluffing." Damien's fingers curled around the edge of the table. Then he just made the biggest mistake of his life, the kidnapping. That night, Damien received a second message, a video. It played automatically the second he opened his phone. At first, static. Then, a dark room, a chair, a man tied up, and then, Silas. His face bruised, blood dripping from his temple. Victor's voice echoed through the speakers. "You didn't listen, Damien." Damien's heart pounded. "So now your friend pays the price." The video cut to black. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. He has Silas. Damien's hands clenched into fists. "Then we get him back." The night was thick with fog as Damien and Eleanor arrived at the St. James mansion. The estate loomed like a fortress, its massive iron gates standing wide open, as if Victor was waiting for them. Damien's grip tightened on the gun tucked inside his coat. "Stay behind me," he murmured. Eleanor shook her head. "I'm not hiding anymore, Damien." He exhaled sharply, but he knew arguing was pointless. They stepped inside together, and Victor was already there. The confrontation. Victor sat calmly at the grand dining table, a glass of wine in hand. Beside him, Silas was slumped in a chair, blood staining his shirt, his breathing shallow. Victor smirked. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Damien's hand twitched toward his gun. "Let him go." Victor took a slow sip of wine. "Or what?" Eleanor stepped forward. "Or I'll end this myself." Victor's eyes flicked to her, and for the first time, she saw something like amusement in them. "There she is," he murmured. "The real Eleanor St. James." Damien's blood boiled. "You tortured her." Victor's expression didn't change. "I saved her." Silence. Then Eleanor laughed, cold and sharp. "You didn't save me. You stole me." Victor sighed. "And yet, here you are, in my house, playing the hero." Eleanor's jaw clenched. "You don't owe me anymore." Victor set his glass down. "Then prove it." A click. A gun, in his hand, pointed directly at Silas. "You have a choice, Eleanor. Walk away now, and he lives. Stay, and he dies." Eleanor's heart pounded. Damien took a step forward. "Drop the gun, Victor." Victor smirked. "No." And then everything happened at once. A gunshot. Silas cried out. Eleanor screamed. Damien lunged, and the world exploded into chaos. The fight. Victor fired again, but Damien was faster. He tackled Victor to the ground, knocking the gun from his hand. Eleanor rushed to Silas, pressing her hands to his wound. "Stay with me," she whispered. Silas groaned. "You two really need to stop getting into trouble." Victor and Damien struggled for control, fists colliding, both men bleeding, enraged. But Damien had too much to lose, and that made him stronger. With a final, brutal punch, Victor collapsed against the floor. Damien stood over him, chest heaving. "This ends now." Victor chuckled, blood dripping from his lips. "You think you won?" Damien cocked his gun. "I know I did." Victor smirked. "Then do it." Silence. Eleanor watched, breath held. And then Damien lowered the gun. "You're not worth it." Victor's eyes darkened. Then, sirens. Flashing lights outside. Eleanor exhaled sharply. "It's over, Victor." And for the first time in her life, she meant it. The red and blue flashes of police sirens cast eerie shadows across the St. James estate. Eleanor stood at the grand entrance, her pulse pounding, watching as Victor St. James was forced onto his knees by the arriving officers. His once pristine suit was bloodied, his lips split, yet even now he smirked, as if he had one last trick left. "You think this is over?" Victor's voice was hoarse, yet taunting. "You think a few handcuffs will change anything?" Damien's fingers curled into a fist, but Eleanor placed a steadying hand on his arm. She had learned long ago that men, like Victor, didn't deserve their anger. They deserved irrelevance. She stepped forward, her gaze cold and unwavering. "You're done, Victor." His smirk twitched. "Am I?" A single nod from Eleanor, and the police officer shoved him forward. "Victor St. James, you're under arrest for illegal human experimentation, kidnapping, and conspiracy." For the first time, Victor's smirk faded. Eleanor leaned in slightly, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "You stole my life," she said, "but I just took yours." Victor's jaw tightened, his fists clenching as the police dragged him away. And as he disappeared into the waiting police car, Eleanor felt it. Freedom. For the first time in 10 years, she was truly free. Silas's recovery. "Don't get sentimental on me," Silas muttered, wincing as a medic wrapped his shoulder. "I'm not dying today." Eleanor let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding her chest. "You saved my life," she murmured. "Twice." Silas smirked, but there was genuine warmth in his tired eyes. Just doing my job." Damien stood behind them, arms crossed, watching silently. Eleanor turned to him, searching his face. "It's over," she whispered. Damien didn't speak at first. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. "It is." For the first time since this nightmare began, Eleanor allowed herself to believe it. 1 month later, the trial of Victor St. James was all over the news. His corrupt empire had collapsed, his assets frozen, his once loyal associates abandoning him to save themselves. Eleanor watched the coverage in quiet satisfaction from Damien's penthouse. "He's going away for life," Damien murmured. She nodded. A pause. Then, Eleanor turned to Damien, her expression thoughtful. "What now?" Damien exhaled, leaning against the counter. "That's up to you." Eleanor's heart thudded. For so long, she had been trapped by her past. Now, she could finally choose her future. "I don't know who I was supposed to be," she admitted. "But I know who I want to be now." Damien watched her carefully. "And who is that?" She took a deep breath. "Someone who doesn't run anymore." The last goodbye. Eleanor returned to the St. James Cemetery one last time. She stood in front of the empty grave that once held her name, staring at the headstone. Then, she removed the ring from her finger, the same ring that had once symbolized a love stolen from her. With quiet resolve, she placed it on the grave marker. "I'm not her anymore," she whispered. A goodbye to the past, a hello to who she had become, a new beginning. Damien was waiting for her by the car when she returned. He didn't ask what she had done. He just held out his hand. "Ready?" Eleanor looked at him. For the first time, she didn't see a shadow of her past. She saw her future. With a smile, she took his hand, more than ever, and together they walked away. If you enjoyed this thrilling journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support our work. Your engagement helps us bring more stories full of mystery, passion, and unexpected twists. What moment in the story impacted you the most? Was it Eleanor's shocking discovery about her past? The intense confrontation with Victor? Or maybe the final moment of freedom and new beginnings? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. What stories would you like to see next? Whether it's another psychological thriller, a heart-wrenching romance, or a suspense-filled drama, drop your story ideas in the comments. Your suggestion might just be our next big project. Subscribe, like, and stay tuned for more gripping stories. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next adventure.